This morning we continue our celebration of Women's History Month as we reflect on the ways in which our Unitarian Universalist faith can be a force for good within the feminist movement. And so we come together again this morning for worship and kinship as we greet old friends and new visitors alike. We take seriously the opportunity to greet one another in this congregation, even though we are not together in person at this very moment. As is customary whenever Unitarian Universalists gather together, we begin by lighting a candle. Our candle flame represents the flaming chalice that is the symbol of the living tradition of our faith. We also invite everyone at home to light a candle as we share our chalice lighting words. Our words today come to us by courtesy of the Oberlin Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Oberlin, Ohio. We light this chalice to find inner peace, love for each other, and faith in ourselves. Also, to be welcoming to whomever we meet and kind to all living creatures. So gather around this light of hope as we share this time together.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome once again to our Sunday morning worship service brought to you from the UU congregation of York, Pennsylvania. My name is Reverend Terry Cummings, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be the minister of this incredibly resilient and loving, warm, and welcoming congregation. And it's especially good to be here with you today as we celebrate, I think, the last Sunday of winter. Spring is just around the corner. And so today, we continue our celebration of Women's History Month. And we do so with a slightly different focus, not only on women's history in the vehicle of feminism and women's rights, but looking at feminism to the extent we are able through the eyes of women of color, who are those who have been left behind by the white women's feminist movement. As you know, many of you know, I'm currently serving on the board of trustees of the Unitarian Universalist Women's Federation, one of the oldest independent Unitarian Universalist organizations. It's affiliated with the UUA, our parent organization. And since I joined the UU Women's Federation board in 2019, my fellow board members and I have been struggling with reimagining what is the role of a UU women's organization. What does it mean for Unitarian Universalist women? What does it mean for Unitarian Universalism in the world to have an organization that is focused by women for women? And although the work of reimagining the UU Women's Federation is still in progress, where we're going really is to understand that feminism, race, class, and gender are all interconnected, and they're part of the work that we all must look at as Unitarian Universalists in the work of social justice. It's really hard to unbundle feminism and anti-racism and anti-poverty work without recognizing that those three are all interconnected in our world. Since I heard a call to ministry in 2012, I've increasingly had to grapple with the implications of my being the unaware or unwitting beneficiary of three different types of privilege that erode my quality of life and the quality of life for women and people of color. I have white privilege. I have class privilege. I was an attorney. I made a professional living in New York City, definitely middle upper class. And before my gender transition, I lived in maleness. And that's something you don't give up overnight. And so I am the beneficiary of all three different privileges. I call it the privilege trifecta. And one of the things I'm struggling to do as I move forward in my ministry is to use those privileges for good, because we need to undo racism, patriarchy, and classism in our world if we are to do the work of social justice as Unitarian Universalists. I'm glad that you're able to join with us today as we continue our celebration of Women's History Month, and as we reflect on the ways that feminism can find ways not to leave women of color behind in the quest for justice for women everywhere. And so, we begin our service now with the first of Gretchen Decker playing hymn number 175, We Celebrate the Web of Life.
Good morning, everyone. Today, I wanted to tell you a story about a woman named Juliette Morgan. And she was the only child of Frank and Lila Morgan, and they lived in Montgomery, Alabama. And she attended the best schools and graduated near the top of her class, both in college and graduate school. She was a public school teacher and a librarian. And later in life, she was the director of research at the Montgomery Public Library, which was considered a very, very prestigious position for an upper-class white woman. Now, you see, for more than 120 years, the Morgans had been an extremely wealthy family in Alabama. And they had other people to do their laundry, to cook their meals, to do their yard work. And Juliette was raised in a time and place where shops and restaurants often displayed whites only signs. Most white people at the time considered African Americans to be inferior. And when Juliette was a little girl, she was used to having African Americans do the work around her to keep her comfortable. But see, there was something that separated Juliette from the rest of her privileged friends. And that was that she had severe anxiety attacks. And that meant that she couldn't drive a car. So to get to work, she often had to ride the bus. And on those buses, she saw firsthand white bus drivers threaten and humiliate African American men and women who paid the exact same fare to ride the bus. So in 1939, Juliette Morgan began writing about this to all the local newspapers, about the mean and unfair behavior that she witnessed on the city buses. And in her letters, she wrote that segregation was unchristian and wrong, and that the citizens of Montgomery should do something about it. The response was immediate. She lost her job. So one morning as she rode the bus, she watched an African American woman pay her fare and then get off the bus to re-enter through the back door, which was common at the time. But as soon as this woman stepped off the bus, the white bus driver pulled away, leaving this African American woman behind, who had already paid to ride the bus. Juliette Morgan was incensed. She immediately stood up and pulled the emergency brake cord. She demanded that the bus driver open the door and let the woman come on board. Everyone around her, African American and white, were stunned. And in the days that followed, Juliet pulled the emergency cord many times. Every time she witnessed this injustice, she did it. And news began to spread quickly, and bus drivers, they didn't like Juliet Morgan. When she got angry, she would get off the bus and she'd walk where she was going, even if it was more than a mile. White passengers made fun of her as she got off the bus. Her own mother told her that she was making a fool of herself and she was tarnishing her family's good name. Then, on a fateful day in December 1955, an African-American passenger named Rosa Parks, who I'm sure you've all heard of, refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery City bus. That action sparked a citywide protest, a boycott of the buses. Juliet Morgan wrote another letter to the newspapers in support of the boycott. And wouldn't you know, she began receiving threatening letters and telephone calls, and the city mayor demanded that the library fire her. Even though they didn't fire her, they told officials not to publish any more of her letters. And at first she promised to remain silent, but it was really hard because she was witnessing all these injustices. At the time of the boycott, people were bombing churches and homes of African Americans. So finally, in 1957, there was a white newspaper editor who basically said that racists were responsible for what was happening and the violence that was occurring. And Juliet Morgan, breaking her silence, wrote into this editor thanking him and supporting what she had done. And the editor published her letter, and it said, let me see if I can read it here. She wrote, "There are so many Southerners from various walks of life that know you are right. They know that they call our Southern way of life must change. Many of them are even eager for change, but are afraid to express themselves. So afraid to stand alone. I had begun to wonder if there were any men in the state, any white men, with any moral courage." So she was reluctant to have that letter published, but because she had said that she would stay quiet, right? But she felt that she had a personal responsibility to encourage other white people to confront the racism. And she hoped that her letter would cause other white people to take a stand for justice. 50 years later, people in Alabama began to see that Morgan was right, and she was inducted into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame in 2005. She gave away certain privileges that she had to make sure that she could help bring justice to others. She was educated. She was of a high social status. She had wealth. She had white skin in a racist society. She used those to help fight injustices that she saw. She risked some of her comfort to go after those who were perpetrating injustices. And I'm sure it made a lot of people uncomfortable, but that's not the purpose of justice. The purpose of justice is justice, not comfortability. So as you think about what it means, what lenses, what privileges that you hold, remember that our UU faith calls us to honor every living being with worth and dignity, to work for justice, equity, and compassion in all our human relations. This is what our faith calls us to do. And think about Juliet Hampton Morgan giving up her privileges, or using her privileges rather, and taking risks to help end injustices, wherever they may be. Blessed be. Amen.
We come to that moment in our service when we ask you to make a financial contribution to our church. Your generosity helps to defray UUCY's operating expenses and also helps out organizations in our community that are engaged in work that's in keeping with our Unitarian Universalist principles and values. The official period for our pledge campaign has ended, and we are grateful for the generous response so far. If you have not submitted your 2021-22 pledge form, you can still do that. The form should be filled out and mailed to the UUCY office. While our finances have remained strong during this current challenging year, one area we are behind in is revenue from the collection plate. And that's because the collection plate hasn't been passed for a while. If a few of you tuning in today could set up recurring text-to-give donations, we could begin to reduce that shortfall. Here's our mini giving challenge for the week. I want to see if we can add at least 5 new weekly donors today. You can do this after service. You don't need to do it now. Use your phone to set up your text-to-give account, then follow the directions to make a donation and then make it recurring. Doing so will help us reach our budget goals for this year, and you will be increasing the amount for our monthly Share the Plate partners. For the month of March, our Share the Plate partner is CASA in Action, Pennsylvania. CASA in Action has approximately 100,000 members and has mobilized millions of voters to elect progressive leaders supporting immigrants and communities of color throughout the country and including the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Now is that we ask that you please be as generous as you can when you're making your gifts to UUCY. No donation is too small, and they will be used wisely and well. Our reading today is an excerpt from the recent book, Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot by writer, speaker, and blogger Mickey Kendall. A woman stopped me one day, years after I was done with hunger as something to manage in my personal life, and she asked for help buying groceries. I gave her what I could and went on with my day. It cost me some money that I could afford to lose, and we parted ways quickly. I almost forgot about it, to be completely honest. I subscribe to my own internal version of the butterfly theory when it comes to kindness. One day I was in the same area and a woman I didn't recognize paid for my groceries. She wouldn't take my money and looked at me when I tried to argue and said, "I didn't argue with you, now did I?" It hit me then that she was the same woman who had asked for my help with groceries. She had been my neighbor the whole time, and while I didn't remember her, she remembered me very well. This isn't a story about how great I am. You see, when I bought those groceries, I said something offhanded about remembering how hard it can be at the end of the month when stamps run out. I assumed she was there because she was getting inadequate help. Actually, she wasn't getting any help. She'd lost her job and her spouse, and her life was just crumbling, and I had insulted her somewhat by suggesting she was on food stamps. It hadn't been intentional, and when she mentioned it, I apologized. She laughed at me and said she'd eventually gotten over it, that being able to eat and feed her kids for those few weeks got her to get some help. It worked out. She got back on her feet and she was doing fine when I saw her, but she had been both grateful and angry at me for a while. It's a funny place to be, and I understand it, but I might not be able to explain it to anyone who has never experienced that loss of pride, that shame that you simply cannot do it all on your own no matter how hard you work. What she needed was the food, the cash. What she didn't need was my assumptions, or to have to feel grateful, or that there was something to be ashamed of in seeking help. And maybe if we could admit that most women are poor, that many are struggling to feed themselves and their children, or their other family members, we could start addressing this issue that affects most women with all the power it requires. We could stop acting like food insecurity is a sin or a shame for any individual and treat it rightfully like an indictment of our society. The good news is that women in these communities are working to combat hunger with everything from community gardens to food cooperatives. Whether it is transportation for those who lack access to well-stocked stores or pooling resources to feed kids in the summer when school is out, there is no shortage of grassroots initiatives devoted to bringing food to those who need it the most. The bad news is that none of those programs are enough to effectively combat hunger on their own. They need more resources, more employees, more efforts by the government to solve the problem across the country. And they don't have the connections, resources, or time to lobby politicians and provide services. Charity may begin at home, but it is fundamentally incapable of solving a societal ill without some measure of government-funded programs that are less focused on being restrictive or punitive and more focused on making sure that the most vulnerable are cared for, regardless of income. Thus ends our reading.
During my lifetime and the lifetime of my generation, we have seen major changes in the way women are received in the workplace, different opportunities, great strides just in the few short decades that I've been alive, from where women were 50 years ago to where they are now, in terms of opportunity, employment, and work, and money. If only that were true for all women everywhere, and it is not. And despite the incredible advances that women have made in the last few decades, there are still inexcusable disparities. Women simply do not get paid the same amount as their male counterparts for doing the same work the way that they should. And there are also less obvious discriminations against women in our society. I remember an article I read a few months ago about how razor blades, for example, that are in pink plastic are charged more, have a higher price than razor blades for men, even though they're essentially the same article. There is discrimination in marketing for products. Women can end up spending more for the same thing as men do for the same object. There are all sorts of hidden micro discriminations that women have to navigate throughout their lives. And women in our society today, women who are mothers, still have to balance the joint responsibilities of motherhood and working. It's very, very hard. Those of you who have been through it, those of you who have friends or women who are mothers know the incredible stress and pressure of balancing work and home life. And our society still does not impose the same responsibilities on men in the workforce. And so it is very difficult, even now in 2021, for women in our society. And we celebrate them in this Women's History Month. And even though there have been strides, there have also been failures in that women of color, black and brown women mostly, have been left behind by these advances for mostly white, middle and upper class educated women. None of us who are white can know what it is like to be a person of color in America. None of us can speak for black people with authority. All we can do is try to be not just allies, but accomplices in the work of undoing racism. And that is particularly so when it comes to black women. The work of women's rights and equality, often referred to loosely as feminine, has a history of triumph and setbacks. And the attitudes of the people who were involved in many ways during these triumphs and setbacks reflected the attitudes of the times. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which guaranteed women the right to vote, was a long overdue triumph. Although history has shown that up until now, 100 years later, the right to vote has mostly benefited white women. And the state's failure to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, which would provide equality of rights under the law for everybody, regardless of their sex. The Equal Rights Amendment has not been ratified, and that is a setback. And I believe it's a setback mostly for women of color than it is for white women. And I can't help but wondering if there was more at stake for white women in the Equal Rights Amendment, whether it would have been ratified after all. As the movement in support of black lives justifiably gains momentum, including support from any of us who identify as white, 400 years of injustice targeted at women of color can no longer be swept under the rug. And that means that we have to own up to the fact that millions of women of color have suffered in ways that are unique and different from the suffering of black men. One horrible example from history that is striking, for example, is that in the days of slavery, black women were used simply to reproduce children, to be used in the plantations, like cattle, producing offspring and having the offspring sold. Recently, a number of writers have pointed out that the feminist movement in America, far from improving the lives of black women, have left them behind at best and even made their lives worse. These writers have shown that the feminist movement, which most, if not all of us, support and appreciate, has been up to now essentially a movement by white women, for white women, a movement that, by seeking equality for a few, has reinforced systems of patriarchy. Let me give you an example. The Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, is often referred to as the Alice Paul Amendment. Alice Paul was a suffragist who was born in New Jersey in 1885. She spent her entire life working for women's suffrage, and after the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, she spent her life advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment. Alice Paul was a white woman from a wealthy family, privileged, and she is credited with making a major contribution to women's suffrage. In 1913, Alice Paul organized the women's suffrage procession in Washington, D.C. That procession was scheduled to take place the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. Alice Paul did an incredible job of organizing women around the country, and on the day of the procession, or the day before the procession, 8,000 women were ready to march. And then dozens of black women arrived to join the march as well. They had been encouraged to go there by the National Association of Colored Women. This created a dilemma for Alice Paul and the other organizers. Should the black women be allowed to march with them, among them, or should they be segregated? In keeping with the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist, these black women were relegated to the back of the march. Not all of them accepted this. One, a journalist from Illinois called Ida B. Wells, marched with her white colleagues from Illinois, and her picture was taken by a journalist, and the day after the march, her picture appeared in the Chicago Daily Tribune with the white marchers. Alice Paul's decision to segregate the black women marchers was inexcusable, but it wasn't unusual for the times in which she lived. In fact, going back to the earliest days of the Civil War and after the Civil War, when the energy for women's suffrage started to gain traction, the thought was that only educated women, people who could read and write, should be given the vote. And this, by definition, excluded black women, former slaves who never had an education. Class difference was there from the very outset. In a book published in just the last couple of months called White Feminism by Koa Beck, she is a journalist and former editor for such women's magazines as Marie Claire. Koa Beck criticizes the feminism movement in the United States through the lens of a black woman. It's interesting because Koa Beck passes as a white woman, and she passes as a straight heterosexual white woman, but she's black and she's gay. As a writer and journalist for publications that claim to be about women's issues and supportive of them, she describes her role as an editor and journalist being discouraged by her superiors from reporting on issues of importance to women of color, like hunger and housing. I learned somewhere in the middle of my career, she writes, that in many of the glass conference rooms where I plotted out coverage, the reality of women's lives stopped somewhere around attaining a white-collar leadership position, achieving a heterosexual marriage with a cisgender man who also changed diapers. Topics like birth control, access to health care, the gap in women's wages, job discrimination, incarceration, food insecurity, and poor housing were not sufficiently of interest to readers who cared about their own individual independence financial stability, and increased rights. In other words, middle and upper class white women. Kohlbeck in her book takes us back to the whole history of the feminist movement in the United States, including the impact in the 1970s of books some of you may remember, like Erica Jong's Fear of Flying and Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch. And she makes a very compelling showing of how white women's quest for equality in the guise of feminism has mostly been about their individual gains without regard to the women at the bottom of the pyramid. Women like the domestic workers, privileged white women hired to clean their houses while they're out working. She writes, maybe if women of color weren't relegated to sweeping floors, caring for children, and doing laundry for little or no money for centuries, we would have been recognized as having the potential to make contributions to society and culture that will go beyond the ephemeral needs for more groceries, clean sinks, and fed children. But somebody who didn't cost very much had to wash dishes and pick cotton and produce and cook all the food and clean up after it. Sometimes this was white women, but most of the time it was, and still is, women of color, a practice that white feminism has directly inherited when strategizing their own goals around perennial needs like childcare and domestic help. At the heart of the criticism of white feminism lies this, that most white women's idea of feminism begins and ends with the notion of gender equality within the existing social system. And this leaves unchallenged the white supremacist, privileged patriarchy from which all genders need to be liberated. In her book, Kohlbeck repeatedly also notes the exclusionary effect of white feminism on transgender and non-binary people, as well as on women of color, people like me. In the reading that Dan read for us today, we heard a brief anecdote from the experience of a woman of color who has experienced food insecurity herself and for her child. A woman who has personal experience of going hungry because she didn't have money to buy enough food. In her book, Mickey Kendall, Hood Feminism, calls upon us to ask the question, why have black women been forgotten by the feminist movement? And I think the answer lies that just as Alice Paul did in 1913, stereotypes about women of color and black people in general still abound among the white population, including white women. And social class, too, continues to play a big role, particularly as women of color have been invisible in the workforce for so long. The movement for women's rights and equality, often sometimes referred loosely as feminism, has a history of triumphs and setbacks. And the attitudes of the people who were involved in many ways reflected the attitudes of those times. As we move deeper and deeper into the 21st century, the triumphs and setbacks of the feminist movement will reflect the attitudes of people like us. Could we, as Unitarian Universalists, find ways to approach feminism from a perspective that is not exclusionary of women of color, of trans and non-binary individuals? I think we can. Most of you are familiar that we Unitarian Universalists have 7 principles. Many of you are not aware that we are currently working on or considering adopting an 8th principle to our Unitarian Universalist statement of principles. And the proposed 8th principle reads as follows. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. Accountably dismantle racism. Last June, at my suggestion, your Board of Trustees adopted a resolution to pursue adopting the 8th principle for our congregation. And at some point in the future, it is possible the board will ask you as a congregation to vote to approve that at a congregational meeting. We need to have some discussions about that, of course, in the meantime. But now is the time, as we focus on the Black Lives Matter movement, what came of the fate of George Floyd, where we're going as a country, it is time for us to also reflect what we as Unitarian Universalists can do as part of the feminist movement to affirm black women's lives. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
And our closing words today are a poem by Maya Angelou, African-American poet. It's called "And Still I Rise." You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room? Just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame I rise, up from a past that's rooted in pain I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling I bear in the tide, leaving behind nights of terror and fear I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise.
Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way on the road from greed to giving. Love will guide us through the hard night. If you cannot sing like angels, if you cannot speak before thousands, you can give from deep within you. You can change the world with your love. Love will guide us. Peace has tried us.